Hello everyone, as I've mentioned in several previous videos, Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze is probably my favorite video game. There are games that I think are closer to objectively perfect, and ones that are better in one specific regard, but overall, given my taste and preferences, yeah, I love Tropical Freeze the most. I replay the game every year or so because of its inventive level design, tight controls, impressive visuals, elaborate set pieces, amazing soundtrack, and generally just fantastic vibes. But like I already implied, that doesn't mean I think it's flawless. The game's banana collection bonus rooms are too repetitive, using Diddy Kong is arguably pointless, some levels feel way less memorable and lower effort than others, and as a whole, Seabreeze Cove, the underwater world, just isn't that great. I remember when Tropical Freeze first came out, word on the street was that it was the first 2D platformer that had finally cracked the code in terms of making engaging underwater levels. But although I think it does do a decent job at making these sections more dynamic and fast-paced than similar parts of other games, overall I struggle to believe that there's anyone who actually likes swimming through the game's levels as much as running and jumping through them. And I don't think that's because of any kind of failure on the part of the game's designers, this is something that's inherent to underwater gameplay as a concept. The core principle that makes platformer design engaging is the threat posed by gravity. The fact that every time you jump, there's a limited window of time in which you have to make sure you land where you want to end up, or else you'll continue going down to somewhere you might not want to end up. But the floaty, unrestricted, all-directional movement at the player's disposal in the underwater sections of most 2D platformers makes it to where that entire central aspect of normal platformer design is absent, and there's nothing that can fill that void. Still, Tropical Freeze tries its best by giving the player a sort of torpedo dive move that alleviates some of the typical underwater slowness, and also allowing for 360-degree movement using the L-stick, which makes the swimming controls abnormally precise. And I think this does go a long way towards making traversing this world of underwater levels relatively enjoyable, even though, like I said earlier, it's still by far the game's weakest area. However, there's no amount of fancy underwater movement options that could have saved what is, in my opinion, not just the worst level in this world, but by far the worst part of the entire game. I'm talking about Shoal Atoll, Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze's Metroidvania level. Despite their mechanical complexity, most levels in the game are quite straightforward. Almost any given Tropical Freeze stage consists of a handful of linear platforming segments with checkpoints in between that build up ideas and gimmicks which are usually paid off in some sort of bombastic set piece. But Shoal Atoll isn't anything like the game's other levels. It's a non-linear underwater maze without any checkpoints where the player has to find 5 colorful keys to unlock matching treasure chests and then this gate to get to the goal. And when I say maze, I do mean that literally. The level is made up of 10 rooms that are all interconnected through a crisscrossing network of one-way tunnels. This makes it to where, despite the area's compactness, it's really easy to get lost and have to backtrack through sections. In fact, one of my biggest problems with the level is that it is too easy to get lost. Let me demonstrate what I mean by going through a number of potential routes the player might take when first playing through Shoal Atoll and keeping track of the rooms we pass through. The most efficient way to beat the level is to go from room A to B to C to D, where we pick up the red key, which then leads us back to room B, where we can use it to get the green key. Then after going through rooms E and F, we can trade the green key for the blue one in room G. Then in room H, we have to connect these bananas to access the lower half of room E, which leads to room I, where the yellow key can be found. Finally, we have to make our way back through rooms A, B, and C to get the purple key in room F, which leads us to room J and the end of the level. So the most efficient way to beat the stage takes 16 rooms, which isn't that crazy considering all of these are no more than 2 or 3 screens in size. But let's assume most players making their way through this level for the first time aren't psychic and won't instinctively know which door to go through in each section. If in room B we go through the lower tunnel, this immediately adds anywhere between 4 and 7 unnecessary rooms to our route. The same also goes for this tunnel on the right side of room C. There is nothing the player can do in these areas as far as progressing towards the goal goes until they've grabbed the first 2 keys. And given you have to blindly choose between a pair of doors twice just to get to the red key, there's a 3 in 4 chance any given player ends up wasting their time like this at the start of the level. After getting the red key, you're pretty much bound to run into the green and blue ones, but as for the yellow one, not quite. See, room H features a tunnel back to B on the left that is basically a red herring. You don't need to go through this to work your way towards beating the level, so it just adds at least 5 unnecessary rooms to your sequence. Instead, as I mentioned earlier, the way to progress in this area is to collect the leftmost of these floating banana swirls, which opens up a tunnel that leads to rooms E and I and the yellow key. If you haven't played this game or any other Donkey Kong Countries, it's gonna be hard for me to emphasize just how wacky that is. Although these games constantly require the player to collect groups of bananas to spawn optional collectibles, I believe this is the only time in any of them that doing so is required to beat a level. And given these bananas don't necessarily appear in a pattern that makes them easy to collect in sequence, I really have no idea what the designers were thinking with this one. So as you can imagine, I have memories of being completely stumped by this part of the level, leading me to go around in circles and waste my time until I randomly stumbled upon the solution. The only reason I remember that this is required when replaying the game these days is that the frustration that I felt because of this in the past is memorable. So why did the developers implement this baffling mandatory secret? I think it's to encourage exactly what I've complained about so far. See, the thing is, compared to the game's other levels, Shoal Atoll is very small. But by adding cryptic crap like this, the developers ensured that it is still substantial in terms of playtime, if not size, by forcing most players to go through the same few sections again and again. And why was that choice made? Well, because I think this is the most extreme example of what I call the game's budget level problem. The thing that I'd say sets Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze apart from just about every other 2D platformer is the visual and mechanical diversity of almost all of its levels. The extent to which the majority of the game stages feel like standalone handcrafted environments with similarly unique gameplay gimmicks and music is extraordinary. But in order to achieve this variety, some sacrifices had to be made. Not only is this likely the reason the game only has 6 full worlds compared to DKC Returns' 8, but this is also where the budget level thing comes in. See, over the past decade of playing the game, I've come to realize that each of Tropical Freeze's 6 main worlds feature 1 or 2 stages that aren't nearly as elaborate as the others. Whereas most of the game's levels feature unique assets, complex set pieces, and original music, these are more traditional in the way they mostly reuse elements from other levels, which I think is what partially allowed the developers to spend so much time and effort on the game's more grandiose stages. Now, for the most part, I think this is fine. A level like Rickety Rafters maybe isn't quite as memorable as Scorch and Torch, for example, but it's still enjoyable in its own right. However, like I said earlier, I think Shoal Atoll is a particularly egregious case. World 4 already struggles to make all of its more unique underwater levels visually distinct, so this one is no different. Apart from the keys, it doesn't feature any unique gameplay mechanics, and it uses the same aquatic ambiance remix as half of the game's other underwater sections. The lack of bespoke gimmicks is a particularly large problem in my opinion, because the game's generic fish enemies just aren't enough to make backtracking through the level for ages even slightly interesting. The level pulls a bit of an interesting trick in the way it swaps out some of these fishes for more menacing versions once you get a few keys, but I assume most players never even noticed that. So the only purpose these enemies serve is adding to the frustration of navigating this maze, which they do pretty well since the level barely features any items that refill the player's health, meaning I've died and lost my progress after getting most of the keys more times than I can count. I guess I also haven't mentioned the fact that Tropical Freeze features a limited underwater player breath system, which also doesn't really work amazingly well in a non-linear environment, in my opinion. Okay, but enough random complaints. I think I've made it clear that to me, Shoal Atoll feels like a low-effort, frustrating labyrinth of a level that doesn't feature any unique gameplay ideas and instead just intentionally wastes the player's time. But what could the developers have done differently to make this kind of idea actually work? Earlier I referred to Shoal Atoll as a Metroidvania level, which was a bit of an over-exaggeration since, although it is non-linear, it doesn't really exhibit many other tropes of the genre. But that doesn't mean Tropical Freeze developers Retro Studios couldn't have applied some of the design principles that formed the backbone for example, the Metroid Prime games that they themselves developed to this level. One of the level's biggest issues comes down to the fact that it is too easy to get lost in sections that are only relevant later on before the players even collected the first few keys. In my opinion, there's no reason all of this stuff should even be accessible this early on. This would be like if the entire map of a Metroid game was explorable from the get-go. No, instead what the developers should have done, in my opinion, is made it to where it is impossible to go down into this tunnel in room F, which leads to the level's second half, until they've collected the green key. So this should have been a green locked gate, just like the purple one right here, which the green key would unlock, and then the blue key would just be where the green treasure chest is currently. So long as one of these two tunnels was flipped, allowing players to backtrack to room C and the first two keys, this would alleviate the level's main issue. Then maybe also drop this insane banana collection secret and find a different way to hide the path to the yellow key, and the level would be way less frustrating and padded. Something else that would also help, I think, is if each of the rooms was made more visually distinct and if the connection between areas was made more clear. Although I hope you've been able to get to grips with the level's layout thanks to this janky map I made, because of its confusing structure and repetitive visuals, first-time players won't be able to do the same, I think. The layout could have been especially easy to keep track of if all of the rooms were part of the same level area. The way these screen transitions break things up is really disorienting. Though I guess technical limitations might have factored into that decision. I'm just spitballing here. I don't actually know what would and wouldn't have been possible during development. Either way, overall I'm not really sure what got into the developers when creating this level. Normally, when I criticize a design element of a game like this, I conclude things by talking about how, when it comes down to it, I by no means actually hate the subject matter of the video. The elephant transformation has problems, but it's still fine. Mario Kart World's Toad Factory is a downgrade compared to the Wii version, but I don't dislike playing it. But I can't say the same thing for Shoal Atoll. I genuinely think this level is irredeemably bad. No amount of small tweaks could have saved it from the awful combination of its rehashed mechanics and presentation and sluggish underwater gameplay. I also think its central conceit is at odds with the otherwise very linear and handcrafted design of all of the game's other levels. Tropical Freeze stages work because every part of them feels so intentional and thought out, whereas Shoal Atoll plays like a gimmicky, slapdash, poorly playtested Mario Maker level. It's no wonder the developers made it to where most players probably didn't even encounter the level, since it's hidden behind 2 consecutive secret exits. The best thing I can say about it is that it makes some of my other least favorite levels in the game feel like masterpieces by comparison. But still, that doesn't take away from the fact that it sucks, and I think it should have been scrapped. Alright, and that's it for this video. I have no idea if anyone will be interested in listening to me rant about one tiny part of a 12-year-old game for 15 minutes, but if you're still here, maybe tell me what you think of Shoal Atoll by leaving a comment. While you're down there, maybe also consider leaving a like or subscribing. I also have a public Discord server linked in the description, and if you want to support the channel and get early access to my videos, maybe consider signing up for a membership. Thank you so much for watching, and bye bye!